There comes a moment in your life when things stop making sense, not in a dramatic external way, but in a quiet, internal one. You wake up in the same bed, you walk through the same routine, you speak to the same people, but something in you no longer fits where you are. And it's not that something is wrong, it's that something deeper is waking up. At first it feels like fatigue, maybe even sadness. You don't feel like yourself. And the strange part is, you don't want to, because the self you've been playing isn't real anymore. It was never fake. It was just a version built for a different time, for a different level of awareness. But now, the walls are starting to crack. You don't laugh the same way. You don't chase the same things. And even when you try to go back to what's familiar, there's a quiet ache in your chest. Not pain, not exactly, more like a signal telling you something's about to change. And it's not easy to explain. You're still functional. You go to work. You answer texts. You nod at the right moments. But beneath the surface, you know, something inside is shedding. You're no longer satisfied with shallow conversation, small talk, surface-level goals. You're not impressed by noise. You crave depth, meaning, stillness. You feel drawn inward, not out of fear, but necessity. Carl Jung spoke about this. He said that the soul doesn't evolve without disruption, that real transformation doesn't arrive through comfort. It arrives through collapse. But this isn't the kind of collapse that destroys you. It's the kind that dissolves what no longer belongs. And that process? It feels like falling apart. But you're not. You're awakening. You start feeling things more deeply. Emotions that used to be buried now rise without warning. You cry, not because you're weak, but because your armor is no longer needed. You sense lies in people's voices, even when their words are sweet. You walk away from noise not because you're antisocial, but because your nervous system finally demands peace. And in that silence, something begins to grow. Something ancient, something true. And yes, it's lonely. Not because you're alone, but because you're no longer distracted. And without distraction, you meet yourself. Fully. Finally. And it's overwhelming at first. But slowly, the fear fades. And what's left is clarity. A clarity that doesn't need validation, that doesn't need applause, that doesn't even need to be understood. Because this isn't about becoming someone new. It's about remembering who you were before the world told you who to be. So if you feel like you're drifting, like your life doesn't fit anymore, like your emotions are louder and your tolerance for the superficial is gone, it's not a crisis. It's not a breakdown. It's not failure. It's the soul rising. You start to feel like you're falling apart, but there's something strangely calm beneath it all. On the surface, everything seems unstable. Emotions crashing like waves, thoughts spiraling, the weight of existence pressing harder than usual. You begin to wonder if you're unraveling, if all the inner work, all the trying, all the searching has led to nothing but this quiet collapse. But if you listen closely, there's something else happening underneath. Something not loud, not dramatic, but ancient. A soft rising, a deep shift. Like your soul is moving, stretching, waking up after years of being compressed into an identity that was never fully yours. What you're feeling isn't madness, it's initiation. The confusion, the sorrow, the sense of losing your grip. They're not signs that something's wrong. They're signs that something old is dying off, and something truer is trying to take its place. Carl Jung spoke of this inner split, this psychological death that occurs when the persona starts to crumble and the real self begins to emerge. He knew that transformation isn't clean. It's not a single decision or revelation. It's a process of disintegration, and it often feels like grief, not just for what you're letting go of, But for all the years you lived without hearing your soul's voice clearly, you start seeing through the layers, the expectations, the performance, the masks you wore so well, they began to feel like skin. And now, every part of you that was built on survival begins to fall away. You cry without knowing why. You feel waves of anger, bursts of joy, deep silence. You oscillate between old wounds and new wisdom, between doubt and insight, between fear and a kind of fierce love that doesn't come from ego, but from truth. It's not stable, and it's not supposed to be. You are not who you were, but you're not yet who you're becoming either. You're in between, and this space, this trembling middle, is sacred. The fall is not punishment, it's preparation. The pain is not failure, it's recalibration, because what's crumbling is the false safety of your previous self, the self that was molded by pleasing, achieving, enduring. And as it cracks, you begin to feel something rise that doesn't need to prove anything. A part of you that isn't afraid of silence, that doesn't rush to be understood, that doesn't need to be held together by perfection. That part is the soul, and it's not interested in returning to who you were. It's here to lead you forward. And yes, it's lonely, but this loneliness is different. It's not the absence of connection, it's the absence of noise, of pretending, of performing for acceptance. It's the solitude of someone learning to stand in their own presence fully. And that's where the soul grows strongest, not in crowds, but in that quiet space where you finally stop running from yourself. So if you feel like you're falling apart, maybe for the first time, you're actually falling inward, into a deeper truth, a more honest path, a life that's not built on pleasing or surviving or controlling, but on remembering. You are not breaking down, you are breaking open, and the pieces that are falling away, they were never you to begin with. You stop resonating with your old life, not because you're angry or bitter or better than anyone, it just doesn't feel like you anymore. The people you used to laugh with, you now sit beside in silence, unsure how to connect. The conversations you once enjoyed feel like echoes. You go through the motions, but something is missing. You say the right words, but your heart isn't in them. You try to fit back into the old rhythm, but the music no longer moves you. It's not sadness exactly. It's detachment, a quiet knowing that something in you has shifted and the old life can't follow where you're going. At first, you question it. You think maybe you're just tired or in a phase. You try harder to re-engage. Maybe if you show up more, smile more, pretend better, the old spark will come back, but it doesn't. The habits, the roles, the routines, they all start to feel like a costume you forgot to take off. And underneath it, something more honest begins to stir. Not louder, just deeper. Not urgent, but undeniable. And as much as you wish you could unfeel it, you can't. The old life no longer fits because it wasn't built for who you're becoming. This isn't rebellion. This isn't crisis. This is evolution. Carl Jung described it as the soul reclaiming itself from the layers it had to adopt to survive. And when that reclamation begins, the disconnect isn't optional. It's necessary. Because resonance only exists where truth is allowed to breathe. And once you start breathing differently, you stop being able to stay in places where the air is stale. The shift isn't just external. It's in the way you move, the way you listen, the way your body reacts when something feels out of alignment. You used to tolerate discomfort for the sake of belonging. Now, your system rebels. Not with rage, with refusal. You find yourself saying less, needing less. Not from apathy, but from clarity. You're no longer trying to keep relationships alive that only survived on obligation. You're no longer chasing attention in places that don't see you. You're no longer holding on to titles, roles, or spaces that once gave you identity because you've started finding that identity within. And this detachment, while powerful, is also painful. You mourn the version of you that could fit in, the one who could play along, show up, smile, and mean it. You mourn the comfort of automatic connection. You grieve the loss of a world that used to make sense, even if it was never fully aligned. But that grief? It's sacred. It's proof that you are waking up, that your soul is rising into something too large, too honest, too alive to fit inside the old life anymore. So you don't burn bridges. You just stop pretending. You stop editing your truth to make others comfortable. You stop apologizing for your growth. And little by little, the life that no longer resonates begins to fade. Not in anger, but in grace. And what rises in its place? Stillness, silence, space, and eventually resonance. Real resonance. The kind that doesn't demand performance. The kind that doesn't pull you out of yourself to be accepted. If your old life feels foreign now, if everything familiar starts to sound like static, it's okay. You're not drifting, you're aligning, and everything that no longer matches your frequency, it's not being taken from you. It's being cleared to make space for what was meant to meet you in your truth. You begin to feel a tension within you that won't go away, like two voices speaking at the same time, but in completely different tones. One is familiar, the old self, the one who knows how to survive, how to keep things together, how to perform. That part of you wants to stay in control. It wants comfort, predictability, recognition. And then there's the other voice, quieter but deeper, the one you've been trying not to hear for years. It doesn't want what's safe. It wants what's true. And now, for the first time, it's rising louder than the first. This is the inner conflict no one talks about, the psychological friction of becoming. You're not who you were, but you're not yet who you're becoming. And in between those two selves, there's tension. That tension isn't a sign you're doing something wrong. It's a sign you're changing. Because when a part of you wants to evolve and another part wants to stay the same, they don't quietly separate. They collide. In thought, in emotion, in behavior. You'll catch yourself doing something out of habit, then stopping mid-action, realizing, this isn't me anymore. But you don't quite know what me is supposed to look like yet. Carl Jung described this conflict as the necessary chaos of individuation, the path to wholeness that always begins with contradiction. Growth, he said, is not smooth. It's full of opposites. And to integrate them, you must first feel them fully. So that battle you feel, it's not dysfunction, it's depth, it's the shadow surfacing, the ego clinging, the soul stepping forward, even if the mind is scared. You'll notice it in the smallest decisions. You'll feel torn between pleasing and being honest, between keeping the peace and speaking your truth, between doing what you've always done and finally honoring what you've been suppressing. And it's exhausting, not because you're broken, but because you're being pulled in two directions: familiar safety and unfamiliar freedom. You'll want to run, to numb, to go back to what was easier, even if it was dishonest. But there will be a deeper ache if you do, the ache of abandoning yourself again. And that pain, once felt consciously, becomes harder and harder to tolerate. So instead, you sit with it. You breathe through the contradictions. You allow both voices to speak, not to pick a winner, but to understand what they've been trying to protect. Because the old self isn't evil. It was useful. It got you here. It helped you survive. But now, it's outdated. And the new self, the one still taking shape, isn't here to destroy the old, but to integrate it. To take the strength without the fear, the lessons without the limits, the armor without the walls. This is the soul's quiet revolution, not in action, but in awareness. You begin to realize that growth is not a straight line, it's a spiral, a return to old wounds, old patterns, old beliefs, but with new eyes. You're not going backwards, you're being given the chance to respond differently, to choose consciously this time, to become what you once didn't believe was possible. So if you feel like a war is being waged inside you, don't panic, don't rush to fix it. Let the tension breathe, let the split soften, because what feels like contradiction now will become clarity later. You're not broken, you're becoming whole, and wholeness always begins with conflict. Your emotions begin to rise without warning. You could be driving, and suddenly tears fill your eyes. You could be speaking calmly, and then feel a quiet anger rise in your chest, like a tide you can't hold back. You might wake up in the middle of the night with a weight on your heart that has no name. At first, it feels like regression, like you're losing control. But what's actually happening is release. Not emotional instability, emotional truth. When the soul starts rising, it doesn't speak in perfect sentences. It speaks in feelings, in sensations, in sudden waves of grief for the parts of you that were silenced, in old emotions resurfacing not to haunt you, but to finally be held. These emotions aren't random, they're messengers. They've been stored in the body, in the nervous system, in the breath you've been holding for years without noticing. And now that the mask is loosening, they're free to rise, to speak, to be felt fully, maybe for the first time in your life. Carl Jung said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate." These emotions are not accidents. They're memory, history, energy that's been waiting for permission to be seen. And while it may feel like chaos, it's actually clarity. Not in words, but in sensation. You're not being flooded. You're being asked to finally feel what you've suppressed. But this process requires trust, because we're taught to fear our feelings, to manage them, analyze them, label them, medicate them. We're not taught how to feel them, to sit still and let the sadness speak, to hold the anger without shaming it, to let the body tremble without assuming we're broken. But that trembling, that's what healing feels like. Not polished, not perfect, but raw, human, and holy. You might not be able to explain where the emotions are coming from, and that's okay. Not everything that rises needs to be understood. Some things just need to move through, because what the mind can't explain, the body often remembers. And what was never felt can never fully leave. This is the body's wisdom. It knows how to release when the time is right, even if the mind resists. So if you find yourself crying unexpectedly, or feeling heavy without a reason, or overwhelmed by an emotion that doesn't make sense, pause, breathe, listen. What if this isn't a breakdown? What if it's the weight leaving your system, piece by piece? You don't need to interpret every emotion. You just need to stop interrupting them. Stop judging them. Stop fearing what your own body is trying to show you. Because every tear you allow without shame, every breath you take in the middle of an emotional storm, that's a moment of liberation, a moment of soul work, a moment where what was hidden becomes free. You're not falling apart. You're falling into yourself, and emotions are the bridge. Your dreams start to shift. They become more vivid, more symbolic, more emotionally charged. You wake up in the middle of the night, heart racing, not from fear, but from recognition. Something was trying to speak to you, and even if you can't put it into words, the feeling lingers. You see strange images, old faces, patterns, animals, places you've never been but somehow know. You start to wonder, was that just a dream, or something more? Carl Jung believed that dreams are the language of the unconscious, that they hold truths the conscious mind can't yet articulate. And when your soul begins to rise, that unconscious realm starts sending messages with more intensity. Not randomly, not passively, but intentionally. Because your deeper self, the one that's been buried under years of roles and noise and logic, is trying to rise to the surface. And it speaks in symbols. You might dream of being chased, not by someone else, but by a part of yourself you've disowned. You might dream of falling, not because you're failing, but because your old structures are collapsing. You might dream of death, not as something terrifying, but as the metaphor it truly is, the end of one version of you and the beginning of another. These dreams aren't accidents, they're invitations, maps, warnings, clues. They're showing you what needs to be felt, faced, forgiven, and the more you ignore them, the louder they get. Not always in volume, but in impact. You wake up and feel heavy, or clear, or emotional for no visible reason. And it's because the work you're doing in waking life is now continuing while you sleep. The soul doesn't rest when the ego sleeps. It gets to work. And this is where journaling, reflection, and attention become sacred, not as routines, but as reverence. Because when your soul is speaking, you don't want to miss the message. You start writing down your dreams. You start asking what they mean, not by Googling symbols, but by sitting with them, by feeling into what they evoke. The image isn't the message. The emotion behind the image is. And over time, a pattern begins to form. You realize your unconscious has been trying to guide you all along. You just weren't quiet enough to hear it. This stage can feel mystical, strange, even surreal, but it's not fantasy, it's memory, it's language, it's the intelligence of your inner world finally being allowed to speak. And the more you honor it, by paying attention, by respecting its rhythm, the clearer the voice becomes. So if your dreams are changing, if they feel more symbolic, more alive, more urgent, don't dismiss them. You're not just sleeping, you're receiving, you're healing, you're being reshaped by something older than thought and deeper than intellect, and all you need to do is listen. You begin to sense what's real and what isn't in a way you can't explain. It's no longer about what people say, but how it feels when they say it. You can be in a room full of smiles and still feel the tension beneath the laughter. You can hear someone say they're fine and know in your gut that they're not. You can walk into a space and immediately feel whether you're welcome, tolerated, or energetically dismissed. This isn't paranoia. This isn't overthinking. This is intuition sharpening, because your soul is rising. And when the soul begins to rise, the filters begin to fall. The ones that once kept you distracted, overly polite, overly forgiving. The ones that helped you ignore dishonesty, manipulate your own boundaries, or keep peace at the cost of your own clarity. They no longer work. Your system starts rejecting what used to be tolerable. Your energy recoils from falseness, not because you're dramatic, but because you've become sensitive to anything that dishonors your truth. Carl Jung wrote about this shift, the development of what he called the feeling function, the part of you that doesn't rationalize but knows, and this knowing, while subtle, becomes your compass. You no longer need evidence to sense dishonesty. You no longer need a reason to step back from a dynamic that drains you. Your nervous system speaks louder than your mind, and this time you listen. But this awareness isn't always easy. It can be jarring, because once you see behind the mask, you can't unsee it. You begin to notice how often people perform instead of speak. How much energy is spent pretending, appeasing, adjusting. And you feel the cost of it, the exhaustion of being around energy that's unclean, conversations that are surface level, interactions that leave your spirit feeling small. At first, you may question yourself. You'll wonder if you're being too sensitive, too intense, too deep. You'll feel guilty for not laughing when others do, for needing more space, for declining invitations that once felt exciting. But this isn't you closing off. It's you waking up. It's you moving into resonance. And the cost of resonance is that you can no longer betray your sensitivity to fit in. You stop pretending to enjoy what numbs you. You stop nodding along with conversations that insult your intelligence. You stop ignoring the subtle ways people twist truth into something more acceptable. You don't need conflict. But you won't abandon your clarity just to maintain harmony. That's the difference. You're not here to expose people. You're here to return to yourself. And you begin to feel it in your body. You feel tight around certain people, heavy in certain places, expansive around others, peaceful in solitude. Your body becomes your guide, your space becomes sacred, and your standards, energetic ones, rise with each new truth you integrate. So if you find yourself noticing what you used to overlook, feeling drained by what you used to tolerate, needing quiet after being around people who talk too much but say too little, know this: you're not too much. You're simply no longer willing to live in a frequency that isn't yours. And that's not arrogance, that's soul maturity. You begin to feel isolated, but not alone. There's a quiet space growing between you and the world you used to inhabit. Friends stop reaching out as often. Small talk becomes harder to fake. Crowds feel overwhelming. And even when you're surrounded by others, something in you knows you're not truly seen anymore. At least, not in the way you used to be. But strangely, you don't crave being seen like that anymore. This kind of isolation isn't about being rejected. It's about being redirected. It's the soul's way of pulling you inward when everything external has run its course. It's not punishment, it's preparation, because solitude, when you're rising, becomes a sanctuary, a place where your voice isn't interrupted, a space where your nervous system can breathe, a silence where the real work begins. At first, it's uncomfortable. We're social by nature. We're taught that connection is safety, that being alone is something to fix, not honor. So you fight it. You try to reconnect with old circles. You try to show up, stay visible, stay relevant. But each attempt leaves you emptier, because you're not just outgrowing people, you're outgrowing roles. The one who held space, the one who kept things light, the one who was always available. Those masks are falling, and with them go the dynamics that relied on them. Carl Jung said, "Loneliness does not come from having no people around you, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to you. And when your soul begins to awaken, what matters to you changes. You stop craving attention and start craving alignment. You stop needing to be understood and start needing to understand yourself. The crowd doesn't feel cruel, it just feels far away, like you've stepped behind a veil, not to hide, but to heal. In this isolation, something sacred happens. You begin to hear your own voice again, without the opinions, without the distractions, without the need to perform. And it's in that stillness that your soul starts to speak more clearly. Not in language, but in truth. You rediscover what you believe, what you feel, what you've been avoiding. And slowly, the loneliness transforms into intimacy, not with others, but with yourself. That's when the shift becomes real. You no longer feel the need to prove, to explain, to be invited. You stop trying to fix the distance between you and others. You stop apologizing for needing more silence. You don't disappear from the world, but you stop belonging to it in the same way. This isn't forever, but it is essential. Because before you can rise into your next chapter, you must release the noise of the last one. You must sit in the discomfort of your own company long enough to remember that it's not empty, it's whole. So if you're in that space now, where people feel distant, the old life feels foreign, and solitude is your new default, know this: you're not being abandoned, you're being held, not by the world, but by your own becoming. You start letting go of the roles you used to cling to, not all at once, but piece by piece. The performer, the peacemaker, the overachiever, the helper, the one who always knew what to say, how to act, how to keep it all together. You feel them slipping from your grip, not because you failed, but because you're waking up to the truth that none of them were ever the full story of you. At first, it's disorienting. These identities brought you safety. They earned you praise. They made people comfortable. But now, when you try to step into them, something inside resists. You feel the weight of pretending. You feel the cost of always being the one others expect. It's not that you don't care. It's that you can no longer betray yourself to keep an identity intact. Carl Jung said, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But before you can become that person, you must release who you thought you had to be." And that's what this part of the journey is. The quiet, painful release of the identities that once protected you, but now limit you. You're not breaking them down out of rebellion. You're simply realizing, I am more than this role. I am not just who I've been for others. You'll feel it when people speak to you in old ways, and you don't know how to respond. You'll notice it when someone asks you to do what you always did, to fix, to save, to sacrifice, and your body tenses instead of agrees. That's not selfishness. That's self-remembering. You stop needing to be the strong one all the time. You stop jumping in to solve problems that aren't yours. You stop defining your worth by what you produce or how useful you are. And as you release those roles, a strange emptiness appears. Not because you've lost something, but because you've made space. At first, you won't know who you are without the roles. You'll feel exposed, vulnerable, undefined. But that space, it's where the real you begins to grow. The one who acts from presence, not programming. The one who speaks without rehearsing. The one who doesn't need to prove, impress, or manage everyone else's emotions to feel safe. And in time, that space becomes sacred. You stop clinging. You stop performing. You start being. You may disappoint people. You may confuse them. They may ask, "What's going on with you?" And all you'll have is a quiet answer they may not understand. "I'm just tired of being who I'm not." This is what it means to rise. To become whole, you have to let the fragments go, the masks, the titles, the identities that were built to be liked, not to be true. So if you feel yourself pulling away from the old roles, if you find yourself unable to play along in the ways you used to, let it happen. You're not breaking character. You're returning to your soul. You stop needing to be understood, not out of arrogance, not because you don't care, but because something in you has finally made peace with the fact that truth doesn't always translate, and it doesn't have to. You've spent years explaining yourself, softening your voice, adding disclaimers to your honesty, overcompensating so others would feel comfortable with your depth. But now, that need begins to fade. You don't crave validation like you used to. You don't look for applause after telling your story. You don't rearrange your soul just to make it easier for someone else to digest. You begin to realize that being misunderstood is not the worst thing. Betraying yourself to be understood is. Carl Jung understood this moment well. He knew that individuation, the process of becoming whole, was rarely understood by others because it wasn't designed to be. The deeper you go, the more you see things others don't. You begin speaking in ways that can't be simplified. You begin feeling things that can't be explained in language. And so, eventually, you stop trying. You start to notice the moments where you would have explained yourself before, and now you simply go quiet. Not out of defeat, but out of discernment. You no longer need to convince someone that your intuition is valid. You no longer seek agreement before trusting your direction. You let people misunderstand you, and you hold your ground in the silence that follows. It feels lonely at times, especially when those you love can't meet you where you are, when they mistake your stillness for withdrawal or your clarity for coldness. But even then, you know this is part of the path. Because the more aligned you become, the less explaining you need to do. Truth becomes embodied, not performed. You begin living in a quieter frequency, one where presence replaces performance, one where your peace no longer depends on whether or not someone gets you. And ironically, that's when the most authentic connections begin to find you. Not because you chased them, but because you became real enough to attract them. And the ones who remain, the ones who stay close even when they don't fully understand you, those are sacred. They've learned to love you without needing to translate you. So if you feel like fewer people understand you lately, if your depth is met with silence, confusion, or even judgment, know this. You're not doing something wrong. You're doing something rare. You're walking toward yourself. And not everyone will recognize that version of you because they've never met it before, not even you. But now you are, and that's enough. You begin to crave silence, not the absence of sound, but the presence of stillness, a kind of sacred quiet that doesn't just calm your mind, it speaks to something deeper. Noise begins to feel invasive. Small talk starts to drain you. Even music, podcasts, stimulation, things you once used to fill every gap, now feel like interruptions. You find yourself pausing more, listening to your breath, looking out the window without needing a reason. There's a growing need not just for solitude, but for presence. At first, you think you're just tired, but this isn't fatigue, it's recalibration. Your nervous system is shifting, your soul is clearing space. You no longer need constant input because you've started tuning into a different frequency. Your own. Silence becomes not empty, but alive. You start noticing the subtle, the weight of sunlight through a window, the rhythm of your heartbeat when everything is still, the way your body softens when you sit with nothing but your own company. Carl Jung wrote that the soul is by nature religious, not in the dogmatic sense, but in the sacred. And when the soul rises, it seeks the sacred not outside of you, but within. Silence becomes the sanctuary where that sacredness emerges. You journal not to be productive, but to make space. You walk in nature not to exercise, but to remember. You sit in darkness not because you're lost, but because you finally stopped running from what the light often hides. And the more you listen, the more you start to feel the difference between distraction and depth. You can no longer engage with things that are loud but empty, the conversations that skim the surface, the habits that pull you out of presence, the spaces that echo but don't resonate, They fall away naturally, not because you've judged them, but because they simply no longer feed you. This craving for silence is not withdrawal, it's awakening. It's the soul wanting to speak without interruption. It's your being reaching for a different kind of nourishment, not attention, but alignment. Not stimulation, but stillness. And in that stillness, you begin to touch something holy. The space inside you that needs nothing, wants nothing, fears nothing, just is. So you start to protect it. You clear your schedule. You say no more often. You create margins in your day, not to be more productive, but to be more you. And this simplicity doesn't make you less. It brings you closer, closer to truth, to peace, to the self beneath the self. And in that place, silence isn't silence anymore. It's home. You feel fear, but this time you keep going anyway. Not because the fear is gone, but because it no longer controls you. It's still there, whispering doubts, tightening your chest, warning you to stay safe, stay small, stay hidden. But something louder begins to rise beneath it. A knowing, a presence, a quiet force that doesn't shout, but stands. And for the first time, fear doesn't stop you. It teaches you. You used to wait for confidence before acting. You used to tell yourself, I'll move forward once I feel ready. But now you understand. Readiness doesn't come from waiting. It comes from walking through. Fear was never the enemy. Avoidance was. And the moment you stop running, something shifts. You see fear not as a stop sign, but as a threshold, a signal that you're approaching the edge of who you've been and stepping toward who you're becoming. Carl Jung wrote, "Where your fear is, there is your task." And that task, when your soul begins to rise, is almost always inconvenient. It asks you to speak when you'd rather stay silent, to leave when it's easier to stay, to risk being misunderstood, unloved or alone, all in service of something more true. Fear doesn't disappear, it deepens, but your relationship to it matures. You stop trying to conquer fear. You stop expecting to feel brave all the time. Instead, you feel it fully and move anyway. You shake, you breathe fast, you stumble, and still you move. Because now you know, the presence of fear isn't failure. It's proof that you're doing something real, something alive, something your old self wasn't ready for, but your new self is being shaped by. And when you keep walking, even trembling, something unlocks. The fear doesn't vanish, but it loses power. It becomes information, not instruction. You start asking, what is this fear protecting? What is it trying to preserve? What part of me is afraid? And what part is ready? And as you separate the voices, the soul becomes clearer. The ego shouts, the soul whispers. But the whisper is stronger now. You'll still feel fear, in moments of change, in moments of truth. When you leave the old, when you face the unknown, but you no longer wait for the fear to leave. You walk with it, you learn from it, you rise through it. And that's when you know you're on the right path. You don't rise all at once. The soul doesn't awaken in a moment of light. It stretches, slowly, quietly, through tension, through silence, through moments you didn't even realize were sacred until much later. What looks like collapse from the outside often feels like alignment from the inside. And what used to scare you, the loneliness, the stillness, the emptiness, starts to feel like home. You stop rushing to fix yourself. You stop chasing meaning in places that never fed you. You stop waiting for someone else to reflect your worth back to you, because something softer has taken its place. Not certainty, not control, but awareness. You begin to carry yourself differently, not with pride, but with reverence, for all you've walked through, for all you're still becoming. This path isn't meant to be seen by many. Most won't notice your transformation. They'll just say, "You've changed," and they're right, but not in the way they think. You're not harder, you're not colder, you're just quieter now, clearer. You know what you need, you know what you won't carry anymore, and for once, you're not afraid to be misunderstood. And that's the gift, not a perfect life, not a polished image, but the quiet return to what's real, to the part of you that was never lost, only buried, the part that doesn't need to chase anything to be whole. So if you feel distant from your old life, if your emotions are louder than usual, if you find yourself waking up in the middle of the night, not with fear, but with knowing, you're not alone, you're rising, and that rise won't be clean, but it will be true, and that's all the soul has ever asked for.